about a business diagnosis, there's this expectation of like clinical precision.
Oh, absolutely.
You look at a failing global supply chain or maybe a multi-billion-dollar corporate merger that has just mysteriously stalled out. And the immediate instinct is to call in the financial auditors.
Right. Get the numbers people in there.
Exactly. They comb through the ledgers, they find that one jagged red line in the revenue column, and the consultant just points at the spreadsheet and says, there it is. There is the structural flaw.
It's a very comforting methodology, frankly. I mean, we are just wired to want our organizational problems to be visible, right? Quantifiable, binary even. It's either broken or not broken.
Like a software glitch in the logistics pipeline, or maybe an over-leveraged asset.
Yeah, exactly.
But then you step into the actual reality of international business. You look at global virtual teams, cross-border leadership, these massive multinational acquisitions. And suddenly that financial x-ray machine is, well, it's completely useless.
It really is.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Because the actual mechanisms making or breaking the company in these scenarios, they are entirely invisible to a standard audit.
And that really brings us to our mission for today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are decoding those invisible forces that actually dictate success or failure in the global business world.
And we have some incredible material to work with today.
We really do. For those listening, our sources for this exploration are incredibly robust. We've got our hands on this comprehensive PhD level academic syllabus, along with all its accompanying scholarly literature entirely focused on intercultural management.
It's essentially the deepest academic frameworks used to train top global executives, diplomats, international strategists.
Right. And it is a phenomenal collection of literature, primarily because it aggressively challenges the baseline assumptions most Western business leaders are taught in, like traditional MBA programs.
It really tears them down.
For anyone listening, you might think business is just this objective science of profit margins, logistical efficiencies, quarterly earnings. But these sources reveal that the true battlefield, the place where capital is actually won or lost, is cultural.
Completely cultural.
We are going to look at how misinterpreting a seemingly mundane email, or maybe misreading a subtle silence in a boardroom, or applying the wrong motivational technique can literally sink a multi-million-dollar venture.
And, that failure happens far more frequently than corporate boards are ever willing to admit in their shareholder reports.
Oh, they never want to admit it.
No, never. They'll blame market conditions. They'll blame macroeconomic shifts. But literature shows us that the root cause of these massive international failures is almost all cultural incompetence.
Okay, let's unpack this from the foundation because I want to make sure we set the right tone here. When we say cultural incompetence, we aren't just talking about like reading a superficial travel guide.
No, definitely not.
We aren't here to discuss how deep you should bow in Tokyo or which hand you use when passing a business card in Dubai.
Right, because that is just surface level etiquette. It's performative. What the literature is doing here is moving far beyond simple manners and diving into the deep structural theories of how human beings actually organize reality.
The foundational architecture, basically.
Exactly. We're looking at the architecture of human interaction, how we process information, how we conceive of time, how we resolve conflict, and importantly, how we confer authority.
So to understand how to manage across borders, we really have to strip away our everyday assumptions and define what culture actually is from a rigorous, strategic, and sociological perspective.
Which is admittedly an incredibly dense place to start.
It is.
Yeah.
Because the syllabus introduces us to some pretty heady foundational anthropologists and sociologists before we even get to the business applications.
Mm-hmm.
People like Edward Tyler, Clifford Geertz, Pierre Bourdieu.
A heavy hitter.
Yeah. And I have to admit, reading through Bourdieu felt like trying to decipher an ancient text sometimes. But Geertz really stood out to me. He describes culture as a meaning framework. Specifically, he says man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun.
That is one of the most famous definitions in anthropology, and for really good reason. Geertz is essentially arguing that culture isn't a physical thing you can touch, right? It is the invisible web of meaning that makes physical actions comprehensible.
How so? Like, give me an example.
Well, think about a wink versus a twitch of the eye. Physically, they look exactly the same. It's just a biological spasm.
Right.
But one is just a spasm and the other is a cultural signal communicating some shared secret. The web of significance is what actually allows you to tell the difference.
That makes a lot of sense. And Tyler takes a slightly broader view, looking at culture as the complex whole of knowledge, belief, art, morals, custom acquired by man as a member of society.
Yes, the macroscopic view.
But it was Bourdieu's concept of habitus that really felt like the skeleton key for this entire syllabus. Even if it took me like 3 reads to fully grasp it.
It's a dense concept, yeah.
As I understand it, habitus is the deeply internalized, socially acquired set of dispositions that shape how we perceive the world. So it's not just what we think, it's how we physically exist in a space.
That is a highly accurate read. Bourdieu's habitus is crucial because it explains why cultural differences are so incredibly stubborn and really difficult to change.
Because you don't even realize you're doing it.
Exactly. Habitus isn't a conscious choice. You don't wake up and say, I'm going to execute my cultural norms today. It is embodied.
Right.
Think about the habitus of, say, a seasoned Silicon Valley startup founder compared to a veteran Wall Street investment banker.
2 totally different species.
Completely. And it dictates how they dress, certainly, but it also dictates how they physically sit in a chair, how loudly they speak, how closely they stand to a subordinate.
Even what they consider a reasonable financial risk, I'd imagine.
Precisely. It is a deeply ingrained, almost physical instinct generated by their environment.
So when 2 companies merge or a global team is formed, you aren't just like pushing 2 organizational charts together on a screen.
No, not at all.
You are colliding dozens of different habitus. You have people whose fundamental biological instincts about how the world works are entirely out of sync.
Which is incredibly chaotic. And that chaos is exactly why the syllabus pivots from these broad sociological definitions and zeroes in on the theorists who actually attempted to quantify this chaos for the business world.
The business translation of all this theory.
Right. We're looking at the big 3 of cross-cultural management: Geert Hofstede, Fons Trompenaars, and Edward T. Hall.
So they take the abstract webs of Geertz and the habitus of Bourdieu, and they attempt to turn them into predictive business metrics.
Exactly. They try to make it actionable.
Okay, let's start with Hofstede, because his work really seems to cast the longest shadow over this entire field. He famously defines culture as the software of the mind.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, it's very evocative. It's the shared mental programming that distinguishes one group of people from another. And to measure this programming, he conducted this massive, unprecedented study using IBM employees back in the 1970s.
Which was a monumental task at the time.
Truly. And from that, he eventually established specific dimensions of culture, like power distance, individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance.
Hofstede essentially looked at the vast, messy reality of global culture and asked, can we find statistical axes that map this space?
Right.
By using IBM employees across dozens of countries, he attempted to hold the corporate culture constant, allowing the underlying national culture to become the isolated, measurable variable.
I have to push back heavily on this methodology, though. The literature acknowledges this critique, but I really want to state it plainly for everyone listening.
Go for it.
Isn't Hofstede's entire model just, well, high-level academic stereotyping? I mean, how can you possibly measure millions of complex, unique human beings, say the entire population of Brazil or Germany, and assign them a single numerical score for a dimension like individualism?
It sounds reductive.
Highly reductive. You are basing an entire nation's psychological profile on a cohort of white-collar 1970s IBM engineers. Doesn't that just put millions of people in a very rigid box?
It is the most frequent and perhaps the most vital critique of Hofstede's work. And the short answer is, if you use his dimensions to predict an individual's behavior, yes, it is absolutely stereotyping and it will fail.
Okay, so it fails on the individual level.
Completely. But that is fundamentally misusing the tool. Hofstede is not predicting what one specific project manager from Munich or one specific developer from Sao Paulo is going to do in your Tuesday morning meeting.
So what exactly is a statistical dimension measuring then, if not the actual people in the room?
It is measuring the societal center of gravity. It is about probability and structural architecture, not individual destiny.
So it's more like a landscape.
Think of it like climate versus weather. Hofstede is mapping the climate. He can tell you that the structural climate of a specific organization operating in Japan leans heavily toward collectivism.
But that doesn't mean it won't rain individualists on a Tuesday.
Exactly. You might hire a highly maverick, individualistic Japanese executive, but the system they are operating within, the institutional reward structures, the deeply embedded expectations of the workforce around them, those still heavily favor collectivism.
Okay, that clarifies things significantly. So if Hofstede is giving us the underlying operating system like the deep background code of a society, then Fons Trompenaars seems to shift the lens toward the user interface.
That's a great way to look at it.
Because Trompenaars defines culture as a shared system of values and meanings used specifically to solve problems.
Yes, Trompenaars is highly practical. If Hofstede is looking at the compiled code of the operating system, Trompenaars is looking at how the specific applications behave when you throw a real-world bug at them.
Like actual day-to-day friction.
Right. How does a culture solve the problem of time? How do they solve the problem of assigning status? Do they assign status based on what you have achieved, your individual track record, or based on who you are, like your age, your education, your family background?
And then completing this trinity, the theorists, we have Edward T. Hall. And he seems to ignore the broader structural values entirely and focuses almost exclusively on the communication bandwidth.
Yes, Hall is all about the messaging.
He divides the world into high context and low context cultures, really analyzing the unwritten subtext of how we share information. So to bring this all together in an analogy, tell me if this tracks. Hofstede is the operating system, Trompenaars is the suite of problem-solving apps running on that OS, and Hall is the network protocol regulating the bandwidth and formatting of how these computers actually talk to each other.
That is a highly functional way to conceptualize the literature. And the critical takeaway for anyone listening who is trying to navigate international business is that if you ignore the operating system, your apps are going to crash and your network is going to drop the packets.
Let's dig into the specific code of Hofstede's operating system, because two dimensions come up constantly in the case studies: power distance and uncertainty avoidance.
Oh, absolutely. The big two.
Yeah, the friction generated by these two metrics seems to be the root cause of most multinational corporate divorces.
Power distance is profoundly revealing. It measures a society's tolerance for and expectation of inequality and hierarchy. It essentially asks the question, how much emotional and structural distance exists between the boss and the subordinate?
And the sources show that in a high power distance culture, we are looking at many nations in the Middle East, parts of Asia. Latin America hierarchy isn't just like a corporate structure, it's an existential reality.
It is deeply respected.
And actively expected.
Yeah.
The leader is basically a benevolent autocrat. They hold the power, they make the definitive decisions, and the employee executes those decisions without public questioning.
Now contrast that with a low power distance culture. Think Scandinavia, the Netherlands, or to a slightly lesser extent, the United States.
Right.
In these environments, hierarchy is viewed as just an artificial convenience. The boss is really just a colleague who happens to have a different set of administrative tasks. Subordinates are inherently expected to challenge leadership, to speak up in meetings, to debate the strategy.
Imagine the friction when those two habitus collide.
It's explosive.
Say you take a highly egalitarian Dutch manager, steeped in low power distance, and put them in charge of a subsidiary in a high power distance culture. The Dutch manager will instinctively try to foster flat, open floor brainstorming.
Naturally.
They will walk into the room, present a problem, and say, all right, team, I don't have the answer. What are your thoughts? Let's debate this.
And that Dutch manager thinks they are demonstrating inclusive, modern, empowering leadership.
But the team, who is operating on a high power distance OS, interprets this entirely differently. They see a leader who is refusing to lead.
Right, because they expect clear, decisive directives.
Exactly. So they interpret the manager's collaborative approach as incompetence or weakness and a lack of vision. The exact same set of physical behaviors signals innovative leader in one cultural climate and dangerously weak boss in another.
That is the tragedy of unmanaged cultural integration. Both sides are acting with completely positive intentions, yet they are systematically destroying trust.
And uncertainty avoidance acts as a huge accelerant to this kind of conflict, doesn't it?
Oh, massively. Uncertainty avoidance measures a society's deeply rooted psychological tolerance for ambiguity, risk, and the unknown.
So high uncertainty avoidance cultures, Germany, Japan, Greece, they seek to mitigate the anxiety of the unknown through rigid rules, extensive procedures, strict laws, exhaustive long-term planning. They want everything documented.
Yes, whereas low uncertainty avoidance cultures like the UK or the US are far more comfortable with ambiguity. They value flexibility, rapid pivoting, the classic Silicon Valley ethos of failing fast and breaking things.
You try to merge an engineering pipeline built on high uncertainty avoidance with a marketing division built on move fast and break things. And you don't just get disagreements.
No, you get structural warfare.
Exactly. The risk-averse culture views the agile culture as reckless and dangerous, while the agile culture views the risk-averse culture as paralyzed, bureaucratic, and obsolete.
Which forces us to ask the central operational question of this entire deep dive. If culture is this deeply embedded physical habitus, this fundamental operating system, how does an individual leader who functions on one OS successfully interface with a team running on a completely different one?
Because you can't just, reinstall your own brain.
You really can't. But the literature suggests you can develop an incredibly sophisticated internal emulator. And that leads us to the concept of cultural intelligence, or CQ.
We hear endlessly about IQ, the general intelligence quotient measuring cognitive processing. And over the last 2 decades, we've heard even more about EQ, emotional intelligence, championed by Daniel Goleman. But the researchers Early and Ang present CQ as the ultimate necessary leadership metric for the modern borderless world.
And the literature is aggressive in proving that CQ is a completely distinct competency. It is not just a subset of general intelligence, and it's not just a flavor of empathy.
Early and Ang break CQ down into 4 distinct measurable dimensions, right? First is cognitive CQ. This is the baseline knowledge. It's basically doing your homework.
Exactly.
It's knowing the economic history of the country, understanding their legal system, and knowing the basic norms, like the fact that you shouldn't write someone's name in red ink in South Korea because it symbolizes death.
Cognitive CQ is essential, but it is merely the entry fee. A late-night Wikipedia deep dive can give you cognitive CQ.
Right, that's the easy part. The second dimension is metacognitive CQ. This is the internal observer. It is your real-time capability to plan, monitor, and evaluate your own cultural assumptions as a situation is literally unfolding in front of you.
Crucial skill.
And third is motivational CQ. This is psychological stamina. Do you actually have the intrinsic desire, the curiosity, and the resilience to adapt and engage with this new culture, even when it's exhausting and frustrating?
And finally, behavioral CQ. This is the physical manifestation. Do you have the actual mechanical capability to alter your vocal cadence, your physical gestures, your proximity to others, and your facial expressions to match the demands of the new cultural environment?
The syllabus references this really pivotal 2011 study by Rockstool and a team of researchers that examined cross-border leadership effectiveness. And they proved empirically that you could have an individual who is a verified genius with a sky-high IQ and who possesses profound emotional intelligence back home.
Right.
And they can still fail catastrophically in an overseas assignment if their CQ is low.
This is a crucial mechanistic distinction. Let's look at why that high EQ manager fails. Empathy, which is the core of EQ, relies on reading signals. You notice a slight frown, a shift in posture, a specific tone of voice, and your emotional intelligence processes that data to tell you, my colleague is stressed.
Makes sense.
But what happens when you take that highly empathetic manager from Chicago and place them in Seoul?
Their empathy radar is suddenly bombarded with entirely unrecognizable signals.
Exactly, because emotional expression is culturally bound. In Chicago, frustration might be expressed with a raised voice or animated hand gestures. In Seoul, severe frustration might be expressed through total silence and a rigid posture.
Wow.
If the manager doesn't have the cognitive and metacognitive CQ to interpret that silence as frustration, their EQ has absolutely no data to process. Their empathy just goes blind. CQ is the translational bridge that allows EQ to actually function in a novel environment.
That makes perfect sense. Without the translation matrix, empathy is essentially useless. And Early and Ang seem to place massive weight on the metacognitive and motivational dimensions.
They do, heavily.
Because, anyone can memorize a rule book, but when a negotiation gets tense and someone from a different culture does something that violates your deepest unconscious habitus, your initial reaction isn't going to be academic.
No, it's visceral.
Right. You're going to feel physically annoyed or threatened.
That is where metacognitive CQ steps in. It's the override switch. It's the voice in your head that pauses the visceral reaction and says, wait, am I angry because they are actually acting unprofessionally? Or am I angry because my cultural operating system expects a linear, explicit answer, and they are providing a circular, implicit narrative?
And the motivational piece is the fuel required to keep that override switch engaged. Yeah. Because the sheer psychological exhaustion of constantly policing your own instincts, of code switching every hour of the workday, it's immense.
It drains you.
If you don't genuinely care about the people and the culture, if you are just cynically trying to extract value, that motivation will deplete rapidly and your habitus will take over. usually with pretty disastrous results.
This is why CQ is no longer considered just a niche skill for diplomats and expatriates. In an era of digital globalization, remote work, deeply integrated global supply chains, every single company is a multinational entity.
It's so true.
You don't need a passport to experience cross-cultural friction anymore. You just need to log on to a Zoom call with your back-end developers in India, your marketing agency in London, and your hardware manufacturers in Shenzhen.
But I want to push back on the behavioral dimension of CQ here, because this is where the theory gets ethically and practically complicated.
Okay, let's hear it.
When we talk about physically altering your behavior, changing your gestures, your tone, your pacing, where is the line between adaptation and just outright fakeness?
It's a tricky balance.
Because if I'm an American executive, naturally loud, expressive, direct, and I get on a video call with a high context team in Japan, and I suddenly start pausing for 10 seconds before I speak, suppressing all my hand gestures, speaking in a hushed tone, don't I risk coming off as entirely inauthentic? Or worse, like I am actively mocking their culture?
That is a phenomenal question, and it is a razor-thin line to walk. The literature frames this tension through the concept of cultural intellectual capital. True behavioral CQ is about appropriate adaptation, not mimicry.
Okay, what's the difference?
Mimicry is superficial copying without understanding the underlying mechanism. It feels like a caricature, and people can sense that inauthenticity instantly.
So how does a leader adapt without mimicking?
Adaptation requires understanding the underlying value that the behavior represents and then adjusting your own behavior to honor that value while still retaining your core professional identity.
Okay, so keeping your core intact.
Exactly. Let's use your example. You are from a culture that views fast-paced, loud, enthusiastic debate as a sign of deep professional engagement. You are managing a team in a culture that views loud, spontaneous debate as aggressive, poorly thought out, and disruptive to group harmony.
Right. So if I mimic them, I just sit there in silence and pretend to be someone I'm not, which makes me a completely ineffective leader.
Right. But if you adapt, you recognize that the underlying value you need to honor is group harmony and deliberate consensus. So you don't silence yourself completely. Instead, you modulate your enthusiasm, you slow your cadence.
I see.
More importantly, you change the structure of the interaction. Instead of demanding immediate open floor debate, you ask a question and explicitly say, I'd like everyone to think about this, and we will reconvene tomorrow to hear your measured thoughts. Or you create a structured, anonymous feedback channel. You are still driving the project forward, you are still leading, but you have translated your intent into a behavioral language they can process comfortably.
It's about translating your leadership, not impersonating their culture.
Perfectly said.
And when a leader does that successfully, they build that cultural intellectual capital you mentioned. They become the vital node in the network that can seamlessly translate directives across cultural borders without losing the fidelity of the message.
Which makes them arguably the most valuable asset in a multinational organization.
So we've defined the operating systems. We've established the internal CQ emulator required to interface with them. Now, let's look at what happens when a high CQ individual steps into the actual arena of global leadership, because the literature takes a sledgehammer to the concept of the universal manager.
Oh, it really does. The universal manager is perhaps the most pervasive and dangerous myth taught in 20th century business schools. It's this arrogant assumption that a highly effective visionary leader in New York will automatically be a highly effective visionary leader in Shanghai or Mumbai or Berlin.
And the syllabus leans heavily on a massive, unprecedented piece of research to dismantle this myth. The GLOBE study, Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness.
A monumental undertaking.
Conceived by Robert House and his colleagues, this study analyzed the responses of over 17,000 middle managers across 62 distinct societies. It is a staggering logistical achievement in social science.
It is the absolute gold standard for quantitative cross-cultural leadership research. And what makes it so powerful is that it didn't just ask what people do, it asked what kinds of leadership behaviors are universally viewed as contributing to outstanding leadership and which are viewed as impediments.
And the data did reveal a few universal truths, right? Across almost all 62 societies, certain attributes were universally endorsed. Being charismatic, being inspirational, having a clear vision, being trustworthy and dynamic. These are globally appreciated.
True.
Human beings, regardless of their cultural habitus, generally want a leader who inspires them and points forward a compelling future.
However, the way that charisma is physically expressed still varies wildly. Well, a charismatic American leader might give a soaring, highly emotional speech pacing across a stage. A charismatic Japanese leader might project unwavering, quiet, stoic resolve in the face of a crisis.
Right.
But the underlying construct of charisma holds true.
Right. But where the concept of the universal manager completely disintegrates is when the study looks at specific operational styles. Autocratic or directive leadership is the prime example.
Absolutely.
In high power distance cultures, an autocratic approach where the leader issues unilateral commands without consulting the team is actively expected. It is viewed as strong, competent leadership. The leader is doing their job by carrying the burden of decision making.
But take that exact same autocratic behavior and deploy it in a low power distance individualistic culture, and it is universally reviled. It is viewed as tyrannical micromanagement. It destroys morale instantly.
This forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question about modern management theory. So much of contemporary Western literature is obsessed with transformational leadership. This idea that the leader's primary job is to inspire the individual to self-actualize, to disrupt the status quo, to break the rules, and unlock their unique personal potential.
It is the dominant ideology of Silicon Valley and modern MBA programs.
But the G. Loeb study and the broader literature suggests that transformational leadership is deeply culturally contingent. If you take a transformational leader and parachute them into a highly collectivist society, say a manufacturing plant in rural China or a logistics hub in Latin America, and they start telling everyone to stand out, be a maverick, and disrupt the system, they aren't going to inspire the team.
No, they're going to terrify them.
Literally terrify them.
They will cause profound psychological stress because the habitus of that workforce prioritizes group harmony, social stability, and collective success over individual standout performance. They do not want to be the nail that sticks out because the cultural proverb dictates that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down.
So in those environments, the literature suggests that servant leadership or highly paternalistic leadership is far more effective. The leader's role isn't to disrupt, it's to support, protect, and provide resources for the collective unit, ensuring the community thrives together.
To borrow an analogy, leadership styles are not universally applicable fuel. Think of it like driving a vehicle. Transformational leadership is like an automatic sports car. It thrives on smooth, individualistic highways where speed and disruption are rewarded. But if you take that low clearance sports car onto the steep, rocky, hierarchical terrain of a high power distance collectivist culture, you will immediately stall out and tear the undercarriage apart. In that terrain, you need the manual transmission of paternalistic leadership, slower, deeply engaged with the friction of the gears, and focused on maintaining stability over rough ground.
Wow, that's a great visual. If you try to force the automatic transmission, you destroy the machine. But even if a leader has the CQ to recognize the terrain, even if they adjust their overarching style from transformational to paternalistic, they still have to navigate the microscopic day-to-day operations.
The daily grind.
Exactly. And the moment they sit down to write an email or conduct a performance review, they hit the thickest invisible wall of all, because the actual mechanics of the words they use are governed by an entirely different set of rules.
This brings us back to Edward T. Hall, and arguably the single most common point of critical failure in global teams, high versus low context communication.
Let's clearly define these mechanics for everyone. The syllabus points to countries like the United States, Germany, and Switzerland as prime examples of low context cultures. In a low context environment, communication is explicit, direct, and heavily verbal.
Very heavily verbal.
The entirety of the meaning is supposed to be contained within the actual words spoken or written.
The burden of understanding is placed entirely on the speaker. If the listener doesn't understand, it's because the speaker wasn't clear enough.
Exactly. If I am a low context manager and I need a financial analysis by Friday, I send an email that says, I need the Q3 financial analysis on my desk by Friday at 5 p.m. The instruction is entirely spelled out. And crucially, because the words are just tools, conflict is addressed directly.
Right. There's no personal offense taken.
If there's a problem with the numbers, we sit down, we put the spreadsheet on the table, we debate the data aggressively, we resolve the issue, and then we go get a coffee.
The interaction is purely transactional. The ultimate goal is efficiency, clarity, and the rapid transfer of the data.
But then you look at high context cultures, Japan, China, many Arab nations, parts of Southern Europe. In a high context framework, the explicit words are only a tiny fraction of the actual message.
A very small fraction.
The vast majority of the meaning is implicit. It is drawn from the physical context of the meeting, the historical relationship between the speakers, nonverbal cues, status differentials, and very often from the silence between the words.
In high context communication, the burden of understanding is shared and often falls heavily on the listener to read the air or decipher the unsaid implications. What is intentionally omitted is often the most vital part of the message.
And because the message is so deeply intertwined with the relationship and the context, conflict cannot be separated from the individuals. You don't just debate the data.
No, absolutely not.
Direct confrontation is viewed as a violent disruption of relational harmony. Conflict must be handled indirectly, often through subtle hinting, through third-party intermediaries, or by addressing peripheral issues to allow the other party to save face.
The concept of face, social prestige, dignity, and reputation is paramount here. To directly contradict someone in a public forum in a high-context culture is not an intellectual debate, it is a profound social assault.
Which leads to the terrifying phenomenon the literature calls the illusion of agreement. I really want to trace the mechanics of how this destroys international joint ventures.
It's a classic trap.
Imagine a high-stakes contract negotiation. You have a low-context German engineering team sitting across the table from a high-context Japanese manufacturing team. The German executive outlines a highly aggressive, rapid deployment timeline for the new product. The Japanese executive listens, nods politely, and says, "Yes, I understand your timeline."
To the German team, functioning on a low-context OS, the word yes paired with a nod has one singular contractual meaning. We agree to the terms you have laid out.
But sociologically and historically, in deeply agrarian, high-density societies where maintaining communal harmony was literally a matter of survival, you cannot simply say a blunt no to a respected partner.
It causes an unacceptable loss of face for everyone involved.
So, in a high-context framework, the polite nod and the yes very rarely mean contractual agreement. It almost always means, I acknowledge that you are speaking, I comprehend your words, and I am maintaining the harmony of this room.
It is a conversational placeholder, not a legal commitment.
So the meeting ends. The German team flies back to Munich, thrilled with the deal. 2 weeks later, the German team demands the first set of deliverables. The Japanese team is utterly bewildered because in their minds, the timeline was wildly unrealistic. They never actually agreed to it. And they assumed the Germans understood that the polite yes was actually an invitation to continue negotiating a more reasonable schedule.
The fallout is immediate and toxic. The German team feels they have been actively lied to and defrauded. The Japanese team feels they are being bullied and extorted by aggressive, unreasonable partners.
And neither side is objectively malicious.
Not at all.
They are just running incompatible network protocols. And if this is difficult to manage when you're sitting in the same room reading physical cues, consider the absolute nightmare of the modern virtual team.
Virtual communication email, Slack, Microsoft Teams acts as a context stripping machine. It violently enforces a low context environment.
Yes. Because how do you read the air when the room is a Slack channel?
Yeah.
You can't. A low context American manager might shoot off a rapid Slack message to a developer in Mumbai. Where's the code for the checkout page? Need it now.
Very common message.
To the American, that is a frictionless, efficient request for data.
Yeah.
But to the high context receiver, stripped of any relational softening, lacking a greeting, devoid of contextual pleasantries, that message arrives like a sniper bullet. It feels like a public shaming and a severe reprimand.
This is exactly why the literature stresses that global teams cannot rely on passive default communication. They must actively engineer a third culture or achieve what is termed cultural synchronization.
Okay, what are the actual mechanics of building that third culture?
It requires profound metacognitive CQ from the leadership. You cannot just default to the headquarters culture. You have to facilitate a meta conversation about the rules of engagement before the work even begins.
So you explicitly lay it out.
The team must sit down and explicitly negotiate the protocol. They might agree. For project updates, we will use highly direct, low context bullet points on Slack. However, for any negative feedback or project delays, we will exclusively use one-on-one video calls to ensure context and preserve face. You are literally writing a bespoke API for the team to communicate through.
That brings up a critical HR scenario. Performance reviews.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a manager from a hyper-direct culture, say Israel or the Netherlands, managing a high-context collectivist team in South Korea, and an employee is objectively failing at their tasks, how do you deliver a negative performance review without utterly destroying the employee's morale? causing a humiliating loss of face and potentially shaming them into resigning.
You have to completely deconstruct your instinctual mechanism of feedback. In the West, we are taught that direct, transparent, constructive criticism is a gift. It is motivational. You failed at X, here's the metric proving it. Here's the training to fix Y, now go improve.
It's the transformational leadership model again.
Precisely. But in a high context, collectivist framework, direct negative feedback, especially if it is formally documented or delivered bluntly by a superior, is not a gift. It is a catastrophic loss of face. It isolates the individual from the group and marks them as a failure.
So do you just ignore the failure? I mean, how does the work get fixed?
You address the failure, but the mechanism is entirely indirect. You might utilize a trusted intermediary, perhaps a senior peer of the underperforming employee, to take them to lunch and gently suggest areas for refinement.
Oh, I see.
Alternatively, you give the feedback to the entire team in a general sense. You say, the department as a whole needs to ensure that metric X is handled with more precision moving forward.
The individual knows they are the one failing metric X, but because you address the group, they are protected. They can self-correct without being publicly exposed.
Exactly. Or you shift the temporal focus. Instead of conducting an autopsy on the past failure, like, why did you mess this up? You focus entirely on a hypothetical future. How can we structure the workflow so that this process is smoother next quarter? You preserve their dignity while simultaneously ensuring the operational standard is met.
That requires an exhausting level of behavioral CQ. It forces the Western manager to suppress their deepest instinct that honesty is the best policy, and realize that how the honesty is packaged is far more important than the raw delivery of facts.
And if the way a culture processes feedback is that fundamentally different, then it naturally follows that the underlying psychological engine driving the employee, what actually motivates them to work hard in the first place, must also be wired completely differently.
Which perfectly transitions us into the next major pillar of the syllabus: rewiring motivation and human resources. And to do this, the literature requires us to fundamentally reevaluate Abraham Maslow.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs is arguably the most recognizable psychological framework in Western business.
Right. Anyone who has taken Business 101 or Intro to Psych knows the pyramid. It dictates that human motivation climbs a rigid structure. At the broad base, you have physiological needs: food, water, shelter.
Then safety and security.
Right. Above that, social belonging and love. Higher still is the need for esteem, respect, and status. And finally, at the very pinnacle of the pyramid, the ultimate goal of human existence: self-actualization, the realization of your unique individual potential. This pyramid is the absolute bedrock of Western human resources philosophy.
It drives how we design compensation, how we structure promotions, how we write job descriptions.
But Hofstede's work and subsequent cross-cultural research reveals that Maslow's pyramid is not a universal truth of human psychology. It is a profoundly biased Western individualistic construct.
It perfectly maps the psychological habitus of mid-20th century America.
Right. But the literature demonstrates that in highly collectivist cultures, which, let's remember, represent the vast majority of the global population, the pyramid is fundamentally reshuffled.
Completely inverted in some ways.
The peak of human aspiration is not self-actualization. The individual is not the ultimate unit of value. In these cultures, social belonging, group harmony, and the collective success of the family or the corporation often sit at the very top of the pyramid. Fulfilling your duty to the group transcends the desire to stand out as an individual.
The operational implications of this reshuffled pyramid for a global HR department are just staggering.
Let's play out a scenario to really illustrate this. Imagine you are an American HR director. You have designed what you believe is the ultimate motivational tool, a highly lucrative, highly visible Employee of the Month program.
Classic American program.
The winner gets a significant cash bonus, their portrait is hung in the lobby, and they are publicly praised in a company-wide email. This is a classic esteem and self-actualization reward. You roll this program out in your Chicago headquarters, and productivity spikes. People love it. So you decide to roll the exact same program out to your regional office in Tokyo. What happens?
It will likely trigger an immediate drop in productivity, deep resentment, and potentially cause your top performers to resign.
Which sounds completely irrational to the Western HR director. Why would giving someone money and praise cause them to quit?
Because the reward mechanism directly threatens their highest psychological need. By singling out one employee, by elevating them above their peers and putting their face on the wall, you are isolating them from the group. You are forcibly tearing them out of the collective fabric.
Oh, wow.
In a culture that prioritizes harmony and cohesion, standing out in this manner is a source of acute embarrassment and alienation. You are rewarding them with an esteem boost, but you are punishing them by destroying their social belonging. And because social belonging is higher on their pyramid, the reward registers as an attack.
That is wild. The precise tool engineered to motivate an employee becomes the instrument of their demotivation. So how does HR function in that environment?
You align the reward with the cultural pyramid. In collectivist cultures, HR policies thrive on team-based training, collective performance metrics, and group bonuses. You reward the entire department. You celebrate the success of the division.
But the reverse is also true, right? If you take a collectivist group bonus structure and apply it to a hyper-individualistic, low-power distance sales team in New York, the system will collapse.
Oh, they would riot.
Your top-performing salespeople will be furious. They will feel that their individual excellence and hard work is being diluted to subsidize the weaker, lazier members of the team. They are being denied their self-actualization, and they will immediately leave for a competitor who offers individual commissions.
This extreme variability places a massive burden on global HR leadership. Do they create a completely bespoke, fragmented compensation and reward package for every single country they operate in?
That seems like an administrative and legal nightmare. You'd have 40 different corporate cultures under one logo.
It is a profound challenge. The literature suggests a framework of global integration with local responsiveness.
How did that work?
You establish a unified global baseline. For instance, every employee's compensation includes a 15% performance-based bonus. That is the global standard. But the trigger mechanism for that bonus is localized.
Oh, I see.
In the Munich office, the bonus is tied to the individual's KPI metrics. In the Seoul office, the exact same 15% bonus is triggered by the regional branch hitting its collective quarterly target.
You maintain the financial architecture, but swap out the psychological engine. And this nuanced understanding of HR leads us to one of the most statistically risky endeavors a multinational company can undertake: expatriate assignments.
The cost of expatriate failure is astronomical. When a company selects a top executive, uproots their life, and sends them to manage an overseas division, the direct financial investment housing, international schooling, tax equalization, relocation logistics often exceeds $1 million per assignment.
And the syllabus notes that the failure rate for these assignments, when the executive has to be pulled back to the home country prematurely, is staggeringly high. But what fascinates me is the actual cause of the failure. The literature is unanimous. Expatriates almost never fail because of technical incompetence. The company didn't send an engineer who forgot how to build a bridge, or a CFO who forgot how to read a balance sheet.
Technical skills transfer seamlessly across borders. The failure is almost entirely rooted in cultural shock and the collapse of the executive's personal support structure.
Right. And specifically, the inability of the executive's family to adapt to the new habitus.
Consider the daily reality. The executive arrives in the foreign country and immediately plugs into a structured corporate matrix. They have a desk, a title, an assistant, a defined role, and colleagues who speak the corporate language. They are buffered from the raw cultural shock by the institutional framework.
But the spouse and the children have no buffer. They are dropped directly into the deep end of the foreign habitus. The spouse is trying to navigate grocery shopping where the packaging is unintelligible and the social interactions at the checkout counter are governed by unwritten high-context rules.
It's incredibly stressful.
They are trying to enroll children in schools with entirely different power distances between teachers and students. They are stripped of their friends, their extended family, and their own professional identity.
The family absorbs the full, unmitigated brunt of the culture shock. And if the spouse becomes deeply depressed, isolated, and overwhelmed, the executive's home life becomes a crisis zone. Their motivation plummets, their metacognitive CQ is exhausted by the stress, and the assignment fails.
This is exactly why the syllabus argues that modern, sophisticated HR departments don't just train the executive. They invest heavily in intense cultural immersion, language training, and local support networks for the entire family unit before the plane even takes off.
It reinforces the broader theme found in the diversity and inclusion literature within the syllabus. D&I is frequently framed in the corporate world as an ethical mandate, a compliance issue, or a public relations exercise. But from an intercultural management perspective, D&I is a hard strategic necessity.
Because if you want to solve infinitely complex global problems, you absolutely need diverse cultural perspectives. You need the risk averse German engineer, the agile American marketer, and the holistic Japanese supply chain expert looking at the same problem.
But, and this is the critical caveat, diversity without cultural intelligence is just a recipe for paralyzed conflict. Diverse teams do not naturally synergize, they naturally clash. It is only when diversity is actively managed by leaders with high CQ that the friction of those different habitus is transformed into cultural intellectual capital and breakthrough innovation.
Diversity is the raw fuel. CQ is the combustion engine. If you just pour the fuel on the floor, it either evaporates or burns the building down. You need the engine to harness it. And this concept of harnessing massive disparate forces brings us to the final macro level application of the syllabus. We've seen how cultural clashes affect individuals, teams, HR policies. Let's zoom all the way out to the macroeconomic scale. What happens when entire corporate organisms attempt to fuse their cultural DNA? Let's look at strategic management, mergers and acquisitions, and the staggering price of cultural ignorance.
International mergers and acquisitions are where the theories of Hofstede, Trompenaars, and Hall cease being academic exercises and become billion-dollar wrecking balls. The failure to conduct cultural due diligence routinely destroys massive amounts of shareholder value.
The syllabus uses the Daimler-Chrysler merger as the ultimate cautionary tale, and digging into the mechanics of this failure is mind-blowing. In 1998, this was heralded as a merger of equals, a match made in corporate heaven. You had Daimler-Benz, the pinnacle of German engineering prowess, merging with Chrysler, the powerhouse of American marketing volume and agility. On paper, the financial synergies were undeniable.
The financial audit was flawless, but the cultural audit was non-existent.
Let's put a microscope on exactly how those operating systems clashed. You have Daimler, deeply rooted in the German habitus. High uncertainty avoidance, meaning they loathe risk and demand exhaustive long-term planning. They operate on a slightly lower power distance societally, but within the engineering framework, there's a very strict, formal, heavily documented hierarchy of expertise.
Quality is achieved through rigid adherence to process. You do not skip steps.
Then you have Chrysler, deeply embedded in the American habitus. Low uncertainty avoidance. They embrace risk. Their survival depended on reading the market and pivoting rapidly. They had a flexible, cowboy-style, marketing-driven culture focused heavily on short-term quarterly profits and speed to market.
When these two organisms were forced to share a bloodstream, the immune response was violent. It manifested as intense cultural resistance.
Imagine the boardroom when they tried to design a new car together. The American executives from Chrysler come into the meeting expecting a freewheeling, highly vocal brainstorming session. They want to throw wild ideas on the whiteboard, make gut instinct decisions, and figure out the engineering details later to ensure they hit the market window.
And the German executives from Daimler sit in that same meeting utterly horrified. To their high uncertainty avoidance minds, this lack of formal structure, this absence of a 500-page preliminary engineering viability report isn't agile, it's profoundly irresponsible.
The Germans demand detailed reports and strict adherence to protocol. The Americans feel like they are being suffocated by bureaucracy. The Germans feel like they have merged with chaotic amateurs. The workforce doesn't just misunderstand each other, they actively resist the integration because they feel their professional identity and their definition of good work is under attack.
And this is why the literature screams for cultural due diligence. Before a merger, companies spend millions on armies of accountants and lawyers to check the ledgers, evaluate the physical assets, and assess legal liabilities. But they assume that because the math works, the human beings will magically figure out how to work together.
The syllabus proves that without cultural due diligence, without an explicit audit of communication styles, decision-making speed, risk tolerance, and conflict resolution mechanisms, the dominant culture will inevitably attempt to conquer the weaker one.
It is rarely a true merger of equals. Without high CQ leadership actively managing the integration, the acquiring company simply imposes its corporate handbook on the acquired company. This crushes the morale of the acquired workforce, leading to a mass exodus of the very talent they spent billions of dollars to acquire.
The text does point out that true synergy is possible, but it requires profound intentionality. It highlights companies like Toyota, which demonstrates remarkable strategic agility. Toyota maintains its core philosophical habitus, the famous Toyota way, focusing on continuous improvement. But they adapt the managerial application and labor relations to the local culture whether they are building trucks in Kentucky, France, or Thailand.
Toyota doesn't source the Kentucky workers to become culturally Japanese. They translate the Toyota way into an American behavioral dialect.
And it's not just the internal culture that requires this translation. It bleeds outward into everything the company touches, especially marketing and consumer behavior. The literature makes it clear that culture dictates human perception. You cannot just take a successful product and translate the ad copy. You have to translate the underlying cultural symbols.
The psychology of color is a prime example in the text. Colors carry profound, deeply embedded emotional weight that varies drastically by region.
Right. In the West, the color red signifies danger, warning, a stop sign, or a financial loss being in the red. But in China, red is the ultimate symbol of luck, prosperity, joy, and celebration. It is the color of weddings and the stock market going up. Conversely, in the West, white symbolizes purity, cleanliness, weddings. But in many Eastern cultures, white is the traditional color of mourning, ghosts, and funerals.
So imagine an American cosmetics company launching a massive multi-million-dollar campaign for a new purity skincare line in Asia, heavily utilizing white branding and packaging.
They're essentially marketing a funeral product. It is an instant catastrophic failure, entirely avoidable with basic cognitive CQ. And beyond marketing, the invisible hand of culture dictates the actual flow of physical goods. The syllabus section on supply chain and risk management was particularly eye-opening regarding time perception. We are back to Edward T. Hall and his concepts of monochronic versus polychronic time.
This is a fundamental divergence in how human beings experience reality. Monochronic cultures like Germany, Switzerland, and the US view time as linear, tangible, and highly structured. It is a resource. You spend it, you save it, you waste it, you allocate it.
Deadlines are strict moral imperatives. A meeting scheduled for 9:00 a.m. begins at 9:00 a.m., regardless of who is in the room.
Polychronic cultures, however, which include much of Latin America, the Middle East, parts of Africa view time as fluid, circular, and elastic. The schedule does not dictate reality. Human relationships dictate reality.
In a polychronic environment, a meeting starts when everyone has arrived, and the necessary social pleasantries, the relational groundwork have been thoroughly exchanged. If you are having a vital relationship-building conversation with a client and the clock strikes 10:00 a.m. when your next meeting is supposed to start, you do not abruptly end the conversation. You let the interaction run its natural course, and the next meeting simply waits.
Which makes perfect sense from a humanistic, relationship-first perspective.
But the logistical implications are terrifying. How do global supply chains manage that friction? Imagine a strict, monochronic German automotive factory running a highly optimized just-in-time manufacturing model. They need a specific shipment of microchips from a supplier in a polychronic culture on Tuesday at 2:00 p.m., or the entire assembly line shuts down, costing millions. But the polychronic supplier views Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. as a general target, contingent upon dozens of shifting relationships and local variables.
That gap is a massive systemic cultural risk. And the Western instinct is simply to write a stricter contract, to add severe financial penalty clauses for late delivery.
But the literature argues that this can backfire spectacularly.
Exactly. Because the perception of the contract itself is culturally bound. In a low context, monochronic culture, a contract is a binding legal straitjacket. It is the final word. But in a high context, polychronic culture, a contract is often viewed merely as a statement of current intent. It is the formal beginning of a relationship that is inherently expected to flex, breathe, and change as real-world circumstances change.
So if the German manager immediately threatens legal action based on the strict contract, they don't speed up the shipment. They destroy the relational trust. The supplier feels insulted and alienated, and the shipment might actually be delayed further because the relationship, the actual engine of business in that culture, has been severed.
To mitigate this cultural risk, the monochronic manager must build immense cultural intellectual capital. They must invest heavily in the relationship so that the polychronic supplier prioritizes the shipment not out of fear of a contractual penalty, but out of a deep personal obligation to a trusted partner. You have to use their cultural mechanism to achieve your operational goal.
It is a profound paradigm shift. Bringing all of these threads together, looking across this entire PhD level syllabus, one reality becomes undeniable. From the micro level of an individual developer trying to interpret the silence on a Zoom call, to the HR director designing a compensation package, all the way up to the CEO trying to fuse two global automakers, culture is the ultimate invisible hand.
It is the operating system running quietly in the background of human history, dictating every single output.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's trace the arc of what we've uncovered. We started by tearing down the idea that culture is just art, food, and polite gestures. Guided by Geertz, Bourdieu, Hofstede, Trompenaars, and Hall, we redefine culture as the deep mental programming, the physical habitus, and the problem-solving software of a society.
We established that the only way to interface with these vastly different systems is to build an internal emulator cultural intelligence, or CQ, a vital, measurable skill comprising cognitive knowledge, metacognitive awareness, motivation, and behavioral adaptation, entirely distinct from IQ or EQ.
We expose the dangerous myth of the universal manager, using the G-Lobe study to show how a transformational leader can inspire a team in New York, but terrify a team in Shanghai. We navigated the treacherous minefield of high versus low context communication, realizing that a polite nod can easily trigger a multi-million-dollar contractual dispute.
We dismantled Maslow's pyramid, recognizing that for the majority of the world, social belonging and group harmony far outweigh individual self-actualization, requiring a total rewiring of how we motivate employees and support expatriate families.
And finally, we saw how the failure to conduct cultural due diligence can turn a brilliant financial merger like Daimler Chrysler into an operational nightmare, and how the invisible forces of time perception can fracture global supply chains.
It is a comprehensive, rigorous architecture of human behavior in the business world.
And for you listening, this isn't just academic theory. Whether you are prepping for a high-stakes global strategy meeting, managing a remote contractor overseas, trying to understand why a marketing campaign failed, or just trying to navigate a diverse modern workplace, these cultural frameworks are your shortcut. They allow you to see the matrix. They take the murky, frustrating, diagnostic, muddy waters of human interaction and give you the precise tools to decode them.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Everything we have discussed from these sources, Hofstede's dimensions, Hall's contexts, relies heavily on geographically rooted cultures. They are tied to national borders, shared physical histories, and local environments. But as we move deeper into a hyper-connected, AI-driven digital world, where virtual teams interact purely through avatars, text generation, and holographic spaces, are we creating a new, borderless digital culture?
That is the ultimate frontier.
Will there be a distinct internet habitus with its own universal rules of power distance and context? Or will our deeply internalized, offline, physical habitus, the programming we learned as children in our specific geographic corners of the world, always bleed through the screen, no matter how much technology we put between us?
It's a haunting question. If Hofstede is the software of the mind, what happens when the mind permanently moves into the cloud? It brings us right back to that opening thought. The financial X-ray machine might still be broken when diagnosing global business failures, but at least now we know we aren't looking at a spreadsheet error. We're looking at the ghost in the machine. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take a much closer look at the cultural subtext in your very next meeting, because you might be shocked by the invisible forces running the room. Until next time.